When we leave tonight, you'll be covered in bruises. My ex said it like he was talking about the weather, calm and certain, the kind of certainty that makes your stomach drop before your brain even catches up. I remember the exact moment because the restaurant lights reflected off the polished marble bar, and the smell of garlic and red wine hung thick in the air, and for one strange second the whole room felt like it had gone quiet around us. My name is Emily Carter, and at 26 I worked double shifts as a waitress at Bellagio Roma, an upscale Italian place in downtown Manhattan, where the cheapest entree cost more than my monthly electric bill. On paper it looked glamorous, crystal glasses, men in tailored suits, women wearing heels that probably cost a week of my rent. But the reality was that I spent most nights balancing heavy trays and pretending not to hear conversations that didn't belong to people like me. Tyler Brooks leaned close when he said those words, his voice low enough that no one else should have heard it, his breath carrying the sharp smell of whiskey even though it was barely past 8 o'clock. To anyone watching, it probably looked like a couple having a quiet argument. But I knew better. I had learned to read the small signs, the tight jaw, the way his fingers tapped the table, the smile that never reached his eyes. My hands tightened around the tray I was holding, 6 glasses of sparkling water trembling just enough to make the ice clink softly. "Tyler, please," I whispered, forcing a smile the way service training had taught me. "You're making a scene." He laughed under his breath. "Relax, Emily. I'm just reminding you how things work." I could feel my pulse in my throat. Around us, the dinner crowd continued like nothing was happening. Forks against plates. Soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. A couple at the next table arguing about vacation plans. The world moving normally, while my chest felt like it was slowly filling with ice. I told myself to breathe, to get through the shift, to keep everything calm until closing time. That had become my strategy over the past 6 months, survive the moment and deal with the rest later. But what I didn't know then was that someone else had heard every single word Tyler had said. Just 2 feet away, at the corner of the bar where the VIP section began, a man sat quietly with a glass of dark espresso and the kind of still posture that made people move around him without thinking. Adrian Romano didn't look like the loud kind of powerful. There were no flashy watches, no raised voice demanding attention. Just a perfectly fitted charcoal suit, dark hair brushed back neatly, and eyes so focused they seemed to absorb everything around them. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know the way half the city lowered their voices when he walked into a room. All I knew was that when Tyler leaned closer again and repeated, "Don't forget what I said, Emily," the man beside us slowly set down his espresso cup and turned his head slightly in our direction. And the expression in his eyes changed the air around us in a way I couldn't explain yet, but I would remember that moment for the rest of my life. I told myself not to look at him again, but curiosity is a stubborn thing when you feel the atmosphere in a room change. The man at the corner of the bar did not move much, yet somehow his presence had shifted the balance of the entire restaurant. The espresso cup rested untouched in front of him now, one hand loosely around it, as if he had forgotten it was there. His attention was not obvious, not the way most men watched a situation unfold. It was quieter than that, controlled, but I could feel it. Tyler did not notice anything unusual. He leaned back in his chair with the careless confidence of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. "You are acting dramatic again," he said, tapping the edge of the table with one finger. "I came here to have dinner with my girlfriend, not to watch you shake like that." I forced my shoulders to stay still. Years of working in restaurants had taught me one valuable skill: smile through anything. So I smiled, not because I felt calm, but because every instinct inside me said that letting Tyler see fear would only make the night longer. "I have to get back to work," I said quietly. "My manager is watching the floor." That part was true. Marco, the floor manager, stood near the kitchen entrance pretending to polish silverware while actually keeping track of every server in the building. Tyler followed my gaze and smirked. "Fine. Run along." He lowered his voice again, that same calm tone that made my stomach twist. "But do not think the conversation is over." I nodded once, careful, controlled, then lifted the tray from the table. The glasses clinked softly as I turned away. Each step back toward the kitchen felt like walking across a frozen lake. One wrong movement, and everything could crack. I told myself not to think about what would happen after my shift ended. Just make it through the next few hours. But halfway across the dining room, I felt something else. Not danger exactly. Attention. I glanced sideways before I could stop myself. The man at the bar was watching Tyler now. Not me. Tyler. His gaze was steady, analytical, the way someone might observe a chessboard halfway through a complicated game. For a brief second our eyes met again, and I looked away immediately, embarrassed by the strange awareness that ran through me. I did not know who he was, but there was something about him that made the air feel heavier. Behind me, Tyler called out suddenly. Emily. My name echoed across the quiet space between tables, loud enough that a few guests turned their heads. I stopped because ignoring him would only make things worse. When I looked back, he was standing now, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket with exaggerated patience. Bring me another drink, he said, and make it strong. The request was ordinary enough, but the look he gave me carried a message that did not belong in a restaurant full of people. I nodded again and continued walking, my heart beating faster with every step toward the bar. When I reached it, I placed the tray down and exhaled slowly. Another whiskey for table 12, I said to the bartender. As he turned to prepare it, a calm voice spoke beside me. You do not have to serve him. I froze. The words were not loud, but they carried the kind of quiet authority that made the room seem smaller. Slowly, I turned my head. The man from the corner seat was standing now, tall enough that the overhead lights caught the sharp lines of his face. Up close, he looked even more composed than he had from across the room, like someone completely at ease in situations most people would avoid. His eyes studied me for a moment, not intrusive, not unkind, simply certain. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. He is my table, I said carefully. The man considered that answer for a second before giving a small nod, as if acknowledging a fact rather than challenging it. Then he looked past me toward Tyler's table again. For now, he said quietly. I held the whiskey glass carefully as the bartender slid it across the counter, the amber liquid catching the warm restaurant lights like liquid gold. My fingers felt colder than the glass itself. I could still hear the man's voice beside me, calm and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to raise its volume to be heard. For now, those two words stayed in my head as I lifted the drink onto my tray. I told myself the conversation was over. Customers talked to staff all the time. It did not mean anything. But when I turned slightly, he was still standing there, watching the dining room with the quiet patience of someone who understood how situations unfolded before they happened. I forced myself to focus on my job and walked back toward table 12. Tyler leaned back in his chair with one arm stretched across the backrest like he owned the place. When I set the whiskey down in front of him, he raised one eyebrow. Took you long enough, he said. Busy night, I answered. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Tyler picked up the glass and took a slow sip, studying me over the rim the way someone examines a problem they have not finished solving yet. You look nervous, he said after a moment. Did I scare you earlier? I kept my expression neutral. You are at a restaurant, Tyler. People are watching. He glanced around casually, as if noticing the other diners for the first time. Couples talking quietly, businessmen discussing numbers over plates of pasta, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting in the polished silverware. To anyone else it probably looked like a perfectly ordinary evening. Tyler smiled faintly. Exactly, he said. That is why you should relax. But the way he said the word relax felt more like a warning than advice. I picked up the empty appetizer plate from the table and balanced it on my tray. Enjoy your drink, I said quietly. I will check back in a few minutes. I turned before he could respond and walked toward the center of the dining room again. My heart beat faster than it should have for something as simple as delivering a drink. The strange thing was that Tyler was not the only person I could feel watching anymore. When I reached the service station near the kitchen doors, I glanced toward the bar without meaning to. The man in the charcoal suit had not returned to his seat. Instead, he stood near the end of the bar speaking quietly with the bartender. The conversation looked brief. A few words. A small nod. Nothing dramatic. Yet the bartender's posture changed immediately afterward, shoulders straighter, movements more careful as if he had just been reminded that someone important was present. The man turned slightly, and his eyes found mine again across the room. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he gave a small gesture toward Tyler's table, not a command, not even a question, just acknowledgement, as if to say he understood the situation perfectly without needing an explanation. I looked away quickly and picked up another tray, pretending to reorganize the stack of menus beside the station. My pulse still had not slowed down. Marco walked past me carrying a bottle of wine for another table and stopped when he noticed the direction I had been looking. "Do you know who that is?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. Marco lowered his voice even further. "That is Adrian Romano." The name meant nothing to me at first. Just another wealthy customer, I assumed. But Marco's expression held a kind of cautious respect I had never seen before. "Half the city does not say his name out loud," Marco added softly. "So maybe try not to stare." I nodded quickly, though staring had not been my intention. Across the dining room, Tyler lifted his glass again, completely unaware that the quiet man at the bar had just become the most important person in the room. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the restaurant again. Orders in, orders out. Plates balanced on trays. The familiar choreography of a busy Friday night that normally helped the hours pass quickly. But Marco's words kept echoing in my head. Adrian Romano. The name still did not mean anything concrete to me, yet the way Marco had said it made it feel heavier than an ordinary name, like something people stepped around rather than directly toward. I told myself it did not matter. Important customers came to Bellagio Roma all the time. Wealthy investors, athletes, politicians who preferred quiet tables and good pasta over loud attention. Whoever Adrian Romano was, he was simply another guest in a long list of people passing through the dining room. Still, every time I crossed the floor, I could feel that same quiet awareness near the bar. Not intrusive, not uncomfortable, just present. Tyler, on the other hand, had grown more restless as the night continued. When I approached his table again to ask if he wanted to order dinner, his glass was already empty. He rotated the ice slowly with one finger as he looked up at me. "You are taking your time tonight," he said. "I am working," I replied evenly. "That is what people do here." He leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from amused to curious. "You keep looking around the room," he said. "Expecting someone?" My stomach tightened. "I am checking my tables," I answered. Tyler followed my earlier glance across the dining room, his gaze drifting toward the bar area. For a moment his eyes settled on Adrian Romano, who now sat quietly again with a second espresso cup resting near his hand. The two men looked nothing alike. Tyler carried himself with the casual impatience of someone used to getting attention. Adrian Romano sat with complete stillness, as if the entire room moved according to a rhythm only he understood. Tyler shrugged after a moment and turned back to me. "You are imagining things," he said dismissively. "Sit down for a second." The request sounded simple, but something about the way he said it made my shoulders tense again. "I cannot sit," I replied. "I am on shift." His smile returned, thin and patient. "Right. The job." He reached for the menu without opening it. "Bring me the ribeye," he said. "Medium. And another drink." I wrote the order down, even though I already knew it by memory. "I will have it out shortly." As I stepped away from the table again, I felt the same strange shift in the air that had followed Adrian Romano since the beginning of the evening. When I reached the bar to place the drink order, he spoke again, without turning his head fully toward me. "Does he always come here?" The question was quiet enough that anyone standing a few feet away would not have heard it. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Sometimes." Adrian Romano's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the espresso cup, as if he were considering the answer rather than reacting to it. "And you always look that tense when he does?" I kept my voice calm. I looked like someone doing her job. For the first time, a faint hint of something like approval crossed his expression. Not amusement exactly, more like recognition. "You are very careful with your words," he said. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and turned back toward the service station where the kitchen tickets were printing. Behind me, Adrian Romano remained seated in the same composed position, but the way his gaze followed Tyler's table made one thing quietly clear. The evening had stopped being ordinary for more than just me. The kitchen doors swung open with a rush of heat, and the sharp scent of garlic and rosemary as the cooks moved with practiced speed behind the stainless steel counters. I placed Tyler's order ticket on the rail and forced myself to focus on the small tasks in front of me. Plates, garnishes, the rhythm of service. Normally that rhythm was enough to quiet my thoughts, but tonight every movement felt slightly off balance, like a song playing half a beat too slow. I could still feel the weight of Adrian Romano's attention somewhere behind me in the dining room. Not constant, not demanding, just there, watching the situation unfold with the kind of patience that made time feel different around him. 10 minutes later the ribeye was ready, resting on a white plate with roasted potatoes and a sprig of rosemary placed perfectly along the edge. I balanced the plate on my tray and stepped back onto the dining floor. The room looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Candlelight flickered against glass. Conversations flowed quietly between tables. The jazz music still drifted through the speakers overhead. Yet the tension inside my chest had not gone away. Tyler noticed me approaching immediately. He always did. His eyes followed me across the floor the way someone tracks movement out of habit rather than curiosity. When I set the plate down in front of him, he glanced at the steak and nodded with brief approval. Finally, he said, "I was starting to think you forgot about me." "Enjoy," I replied. My voice remained polite, neutral, the way I had practiced for years working in restaurants where personal feelings had no place on the dining floor. Tyler cut into the steak slowly, testing the temperature before taking his first bite. For a moment he said nothing. Then he leaned back again, chewing thoughtfully while studying my face. "You are quiet tonight," he said. "Quieter than usual." I kept my hands folded lightly around the edge of the tray. "It is busy." He followed my earlier line of sight again, toward the bar area. Adrian Romano still sat there, unmoving except for the small motion of lifting his espresso cup. Tyler watched him for a moment longer this time. "You keep looking over there," he said casually. "Is that guy bothering you?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I answered quickly. Tyler gave a small laugh. "Good. Because he looks like the type who enjoys listening to conversations that do not belong to him." I did not respond. Instead, I lifted the empty glass from the table and placed it on the tray. "Would you like anything else?" Tyler wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin and leaned forward slightly. His voice lowered again, returning to the quiet tone that made the rest of the room feel far away. "Just remember something, Emily," he said. "Your shift ends in 40 minutes. My pulse skipped once. I kept my expression calm. "I know when my shift ends." Tyler's smile returned, patient and certain. "Good," he said. "Because we still have things to talk about." I nodded once and stepped away from the table again. The walk back toward the bar felt longer than it should have. When I reached it, Adrian Romano had already set his cup down. He did not look at me immediately. Instead, his eyes followed Tyler for a moment longer as Tyler cut another piece of steak with slow, deliberate movements. Only then did Adrian turn his attention toward me again. 40 minutes, he said quietly, repeating the number Tyler had spoken. Earlier, I felt a chill run along my arms. "You heard that," I said softly. Adrian Romano gave a small nod. "I hear many things in this room," he replied. His voice remained calm, almost thoughtful, and most of them are not worth remembering. He paused for a second before adding one more sentence, the tone still perfectly controlled. "That one is." I did not answer immediately. The clink of glasses and quiet conversations around us continued like nothing unusual had happened, yet the words Adrian Romano had just spoken made the air feel slightly heavier. 40 minutes. That was all the time left between the controlled world of the restaurant and whatever waited outside its doors. I adjusted the tray in my hands and tried to keep my voice steady. "Customers talk all the time," I said quietly. "It does not mean anything." Adrian Romano studied my face for a moment, not challenging the statement, simply evaluating it the way someone might examine a puzzle piece before placing it down. "You are very practiced at pretending things are normal," he said. The observation was not unkind. If anything, it sounded almost respectful. I gave a small shrug. "It is part of the job." Across the dining room, Tyler laughed at something on his phone, completely unaware that two people only 20 feet away were discussing the timeline of his evening without using his name. Adrian Romano followed my brief glance in Tyler's direction again before returning his attention to me. "Does he usually wait for you after work?" The question was direct but calm, like a simple business inquiry. I hesitated before answering because the truth felt heavier than the conversation itself. "Sometimes," I said finally. Adrian nodded slowly, as if confirming a detail he had already suspected. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The bartender moved past us polishing a glass, careful not to interrupt whatever silent calculation seemed to be happening between the two sides of the bar. Finally, Adrian Romano leaned slightly against the polished counter, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "Emily," he said. Hearing my name in his voice felt strange. Not intrusive, just precise. "Yes," I replied. "Your manager said you are careful with your words," he continued. That is usually a sign someone has learned when speaking freely becomes expensive. I did not know whether that was meant as sympathy or analysis. Perhaps both. You do not know me, I said quietly. No, Adrian agreed. But I know the tone a man uses when he believes someone belongs to him. The sentence was delivered without emotion, like a simple fact. My fingers tightened slightly around the tray handle. I did not answer. Adrian did not press further. Instead, he reached for his espresso cup again and took a slow sip as if the conversation had been nothing more than a passing exchange between a customer and a server. But when he placed the cup back down, he added one more sentence, quieter than the rest. 40 minutes is a long time when someone intends to wait. I swallowed and glanced at the clock mounted near the kitchen entrance. 9:23. My shift ended at 10. 37 minutes left. The number seemed to hang in my mind like a countdown I had not agreed to start. I nodded politely, the way service staff end conversations without actually ending them. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said. Adrian Romano gave a small nod in return, but his eyes did not move away from Tyler's table. I intend to, he replied calmly. I picked up a stack of menus and walked back toward the service station, trying to focus on the next order ticket printing from the kitchen. Yet the strange awareness from earlier had grown stronger now. Two different worlds had quietly collided inside Bellagio Roma that night. One of them was Tyler's familiar, predictable pressure. The other was something colder, quieter, and far more patient. And somehow both of them were now counting down the same 37 minutes. I tried to lose myself in the routine again. Plates in, plates out. A table near the window needed more water. Another wanted extra bread. The kitchen bell rang twice, sharp and impatient, and Marco called my name from across the floor. Normally, the rhythm of the restaurant was comforting, like background music that helped the hours pass without thinking too much. Tonight, every minute felt slower. I checked the clock again when I passed the service station. 9:29. 31 minutes left. The number settled heavily in my mind as I picked up a basket of warm bread and carried it to table 6. Across the dining room, Tyler had finished half of his steak and was scrolling through his phone again, completely relaxed, like a man waiting for a movie to start. Every few seconds his eyes lifted to track my movement through the room. I recognized that look. He was measuring the distance between now and the end of my shift the same way someone might watch a countdown timer. When I returned to the bar area to refill a water pitcher, Adrian Romano was still there, seated in the same calm position he had held for most of the evening. The second espresso cup was empty now. His hands rested lightly on the counter, fingers interlocked as if he had nowhere else to be. That alone felt strange. Most customers finished their drink and left within 20 minutes. Adrian Romano had been here nearly an hour. I placed the pitcher down beside the bartender and began filling 2 glasses for another table. I did not intend to speak to him again, but his voice reached me quietly before I could walk away. Your shift seems very busy. I glanced at him briefly. It usually is. His eyes moved past me toward the center of the room where Tyler sat, and yet you keep watching the clock. I followed his gaze automatically and realized he was right. I had checked the wall clock 3 times in the last 5 minutes. Everyone watches the clock near closing time, I said. Adrian Romano considered that answer without reacting. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal jacket and placed a folded bill on the counter. The bartender glanced at it and nodded respectfully before stepping away to help another server. Adrian pushed the bill slightly closer to me, not forcing it into my hand, simply placing it where I could see it. For your service tonight, he said calmly. I looked down at the bill and realized it was a $100 tip. My breath caught for a second. That was more than I made in tips during some entire shifts. That is not necessary, I said quietly. Adrian shook his head once. It is not payment, he replied. Consider it an apology. I frowned slightly. For what? His gaze drifted back toward Tyler again, then returned to me. For the inconvenience that will follow you outside this building tonight. My fingers tightened around the water pitcher. You do not know that, I said. Adrian Romano did not argue. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging that the statement could technically be true. Perhaps, he said, but I prefer planning ahead. The calm certainty in his voice made something inside my chest tighten again. Across the room, Tyler finished his drink and pushed the glass toward the edge of the table. I knew that signal well. He wanted another one. I lifted the pitcher and turned back toward the dining floor. As I passed Tyler's table, he looked up at me with that same patient smile. 25 minutes, he said softly, tapping the table once with his finger. I did not answer. I simply nodded and continued walking toward the bar again. When I reached it, Adrian Romano had already stood up. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket with quiet precision before glancing once more toward Tyler. It seems your customer is becoming impatient, he said calmly. I looked toward the clock again without meaning to. 9:35. 25 minutes left. Adrian Romano followed my glance and gave a small nod, almost as if confirming a detail in a larger plan only he could see. Then he said one final sentence, quiet enough that only I could hear it. Do not worry about the walk to your car tonight. I carried the fresh whiskey back to table 12 with the same steady pace I had practiced for years, but inside my chest my heartbeat refused to slow down. Adrian Romano's last sentence echoed in my mind in a way that made the restaurant feel different now, like the room had quietly tilted and only I had noticed. Do not worry about the walk to your car tonight. The words had not sounded like reassurance. They had sounded like a decision that had already been made. Tyler looked up as soon as I set the glass down in front of him. There you are, he said with an easy smile. I was starting to think you forgot me. I folded my hands around the tray again. Your drink. He lifted the glass, but did not drink immediately. Instead, he watched me the way someone studies a small change in the weather. You look distracted, he said. Did something happen? I shook my head once. It is a busy night. Tyler leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms slightly as if settling in more comfortably. Good, he said. Because we have time. His eyes flicked briefly toward the wall clock across the room. I followed the glance without meaning to. 9:41. 19 minutes left. The number pressed against my thoughts like a quiet drumbeat counting down. Tyler noticed my glance and smiled again. See, he said softly. You are watching the clock too. I did not answer. I simply lifted the empty appetizer plate and placed it onto my tray. Enjoy your drink, I said. I will bring the check when you are ready. Tyler laughed under his breath. I am not in a hurry. I nodded once and stepped away from the table again. As I crossed the dining floor, I could feel the strange tension that had been building all evening tightening slowly, like a rope pulled a little more with every passing minute. When I reached the bar area again, Adrian Romano was no longer sitting. For a second I thought he had left the restaurant entirely, but then I noticed him standing near the front entrance, speaking quietly with the host at the podium. The host nodded several times, clearly listening carefully. Adrian Romano did not appear rushed. His posture remained calm, almost relaxed, as if he were discussing nothing more important than the evening weather. Yet the host's attention made it clear that whatever he was saying carried weight. I filled another water pitcher and tried to ignore the direction of my thoughts, but curiosity pulled my eyes toward the entrance again. Adrian Romano finished speaking with the host and turned back toward the dining room. Our eyes met briefly across the distance. He did not smile. He simply gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had offered earlier in the evening. Then he walked slowly back toward the bar. When he reached the counter, he did not sit down again. Instead, he rested one hand lightly on the polished surface and glanced toward Tyler's table. Tyler was still there, relaxed and unaware, swirling the ice in his whiskey glass while watching a sports highlight on his phone. The contrast between the two men had never been clearer. One was restless and loud in small ways, filling the space around him without noticing. The other barely moved at all, yet somehow the room seemed to shift around his presence. I returned to the service station to deliver another order to table 6. The clock ticked forward again. 9:47. 13 minutes left. When I turned back toward the bar a moment later, Adrian Romano had stepped closer, close enough that his voice reached me without needing to rise above the restaurant noise. Emily, he said quietly. I looked at him. His gaze remained calm but certain, like someone who had already seen the next few steps of a story before anyone else in the room realized it had begun. Finish your shift, he said. Do not rush. He paused for a second before adding one more sentence, his voice steady and controlled. I will be here when it ends. I wiped the last table near the window slowly, letting the cloth move across the polished wood even though it was already clean. Around me the restaurant was beginning to change into its closing rhythm. Chairs shifted slightly as guests prepared to leave. The soft jazz music continued in the background, but the conversations had grown quieter and more scattered. Marco was speaking with the bartender near the service station, counting receipts and reviewing the final checks of the night. I glanced at the clock again without meaning to. 9:56. 4 minutes left. Tyler noticed the movement immediately from across the dining room. His plate was empty now, the steak finished, the whiskey glass resting near the edge of the table with only melting ice inside. He leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. When our eyes met, he lifted 2 fingers in a small gesture, signaling that he wanted the check. I nodded once and walked toward the register near the bar. Adrian Romano stood exactly where he had been a few minutes earlier, one hand resting lightly on the polished counter, as if time had no meaning for him at all. When I printed Tyler's receipt, I felt Adrian's gaze shift briefly toward the small machine, then back toward the dining room. I carried the check to table 12 and placed it neatly beside Tyler's empty glass. "Whenever you are ready," I said. Tyler glanced down at the receipt, then back up at me with a faint smile. "Already?" he asked. "You seem eager to leave." "The restaurant is closing," I replied calmly. Tyler pulled a pen from his pocket and signed the receipt without even reading the total. "You are right," he said quietly. "We should not keep everyone waiting." He slid the receipt across the table and stood up, adjusting the collar of his jacket with a slow, deliberate movement. The sound of the chair legs against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. My pulse quickened even though I kept my expression neutral. Tyler stepped closer to me, lowering his voice again the way he always did when he wanted his words to feel private. "Your shift is over now," he said. I glanced once more at the clock above the kitchen entrance. 9:59. The second hand ticked forward quietly. 10 o'clock. For a brief second, the entire evening seemed to pause in that single moment of silence. Tyler smiled, as if confirming the same realization. "See," he said softly. "Right on time." I turned toward the bar to place the signed receipt into the register drawer. When I looked back across the room, Adrian Romano had not moved from his position, but something about the atmosphere near him had shifted again. The host stood near the front entrance, speaking quietly into the small phone behind the podium. A tall man in a dark suit who had not been inside the restaurant earlier now stood near the door as if he had arrived only moments ago. Tyler noticed none of it. He simply walked toward the entrance with the casual confidence of someone who believed the world outside the restaurant would unfold exactly the way he expected. I removed my apron and folded it carefully beside the register, then picked up my bag from the small shelf beneath the counter. When I turned around, Adrian Romano was standing only a few steps away now, not close enough to invade my space, just close enough that I could hear his voice clearly over the quiet sounds of closing time. "Your shift is finished," he said calmly. I nodded once. "Yes." Adrian glanced briefly toward the front door where Tyler now waited, tapping his fingers lightly against the glass as if he had grown impatient in the last few seconds. Then Adrian looked back at me. His expression had not changed all evening. Calm, certain, controlled. "Good," he said quietly, "because the rest of the night is about to become much more interesting."